everyone, and welcome to today's episode of Attachment Theory in Action. Today, I am super excited to welcome Bethany Hall to the podcast. Bethany is a licensed family nurse practitioner specializing in complex developmental trauma. She has lived experience as a missionary and a foster adoptive mom, as well as extensive experience training nonprofit organizations, foster and adoptive families, educators, social workers, and others. She has been married to her husband, Kevin, for 19 years, and they have 3 children at home, biological and adopted. She is also Tia to many young adults now starting their families. Well, hello to all of my listeners, and welcome to today's episode of Attachment Theory in Action. I am, as I've mentioned, really excited to welcome Bethany Hall to the podcast today. Bethany, it is a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks for having me. I've been a longtime fan of the Attachment Theory in Action podcast, and as I told you, consumer of the content. So super honored to be with you today.
Well, good. We are thankful for all of our listeners, and I don't know if you know this, but we have listeners from over 60 different countries, which blew my mind when I
That's
found that out.
incredible.
So, but great to have somebody right here in the Midwest where I'm located.
Yes.
So welcome. Most of our listeners know by now that I start our conversation with the same kind of question, just because attachment really starts early on in life and impacts us all the way through. So is there anything that you feel from either your early life or kind of early on in your career or life that you feel helped drive you to where you are today and the work that you're doing today? Tell us a bit about your story.
Yeah, thanks. So my early childhood, I would say now looking back, obviously impacted and to this day impacts me as all attachment does. But I would say my journey in this area kind of started when I started my career. And I started out in a pediatric emergency department, first as a nurse and then as a family nurse practitioner. And so I spent now going on 20 years in that area. That makes me feel very old, but and that's kind of where things started. So if you've been in this world very long, you know that pediatric emergency departments we do see our fair share of behavioral health and mental health challenges. And so I have very vivid memories when I was a nurse working in Louisville, Kentucky. We had this back area that we converted into behavioral health space, and essentially were kind of like padded rooms back then. So this is
Mm,
early 2000s, and just full of so many problems as you can imagine. The emergency department isn't set up to do behavioral health or even long-term care, and some of these kids were staying for weeks on end. And so that just kind of planted seeds in my head of like, I feel like we're not doing enough for these kiddos. And then fast forward, we lived in Mexico for 4 years where we worked with young adults aging out of there wasn't at the time really any foster care, so really truly institutional orphanage type settings.
mm,
And I also had adopted a child at birth through a domestic infant adoption. And so my world with foster care and adoption kind of started to come to life. And I was seeing firsthand in my own family and in lived experience that we were still falling woefully short. We were giving kids, and I was giving my own children so many things that we know are necessary for flourishing, a safe home and food and helping them get through school. And especially my adult kiddos in Mexico were just still really struggling. And so that kind of started me on this journey of just voraciously getting my hands on anything I could. At the time, this whole idea of the neuroscience behind all these trauma behaviors and attachment was still pretty early. And so it wasn't like you could just go hop online and do a class. And so I just started getting every book, every podcast I could find, and really came to believe deeply that understanding the neuroscience and how the brain and the body functions as it relates to trauma and attachment are just critical pieces that was not only missing in my medical training, but was missing in my parenting. And so that is kind of how my journey began. And then the last 5 years or so, I've been working in this space. I took a shift out of the clinical work and started working in the foster and adoptive space, doing educating and just really trying to bring others along on the journey I had of knowledge gathering.
hmm so firstly, thank you for sharing your story, or at least bits of it to get us in the loop. But just thank you also for your vulnerability in that, you know, you don't know until you know. And yeah, I mean, the field of attachment has been around for many, many years, but the awareness of attachment and the impact that having knowledge of the development of attachment style and how it plays into our entire lives just hasn't really been on anyone's radar in the public, at least for, you know, I don't know, maybe I feel like there's a slight shift happening maybe in the last 10 to 15 years.
Yeah,
But even so, you know, we feel at least at Chaddock, there is a gap still between understanding the connection and the complexities of attachment and trauma together. You know, we
totally.
personally feel you can't talk about one without the other because of the huge relational piece that comes along with healing from trauma, or even how trauma occurs in the first place. So, but appreciate your vulnerability. And, you know, I think I've spoke with a lot of foster and adoptive parents, and it's a similar story. And you go into it with your full heart, with the best intention, um, and the children that come into your care just need something different for
Hmm.
them, that isn't always trained about, right?
Yeah, exactly right. And to your point, imagine my surprise when I started reading about Bowlby and was like, this is a long time ago. How did I never learn about this in all of my medical education or any of my foster and adopt courses? So yeah, to your point, I think in the last 10 to 15 years, it is starting to come a little bit more mainstream, but I would wholeheartedly agree. There's still such a gap, particularly even among professionals. As
Hmm.
we look at DSM and diagnostic criteria, the way we approach medicating children and therapy approaches, I think there's, in my work with Chosen, I find all the time where families are saying, this information you're giving us is great, but our therapist or our physician or our schools, like they're speaking a totally different language and it's coming into conflict with our experiences. So I just love the work Chaddock's doing. And I do think there's still a lot to be done in this space with educating people about these concepts.
Hmm. Well, and so we're going to talk a little bit about that in a bit in terms of advocating for those kinds of families that you were just talking about. But I want to go back a little bit. You know, you and I touched base before this, and one of the things that we talked about, and I think that maybe you can share some of this with regards the first stages of your journey into this world. We talked about judgments about families, you
Yeah.
know, and you mentioned about having behavioral health or mental health crises coming into the emergency room or pediatric emergency
Mhm.
area that you were working in. Tell me about your shift in perspective.
Yeah, so I think coming from a medical background, I would say myself and many of my colleagues would say historically medicine is reactive.
Hmm.
So we are dealing with problems that already exist. And I think as a whole community, behavioral health historically has been viewed the same way. When we have major problems, we medicate the problem, versus taking a more holistic approach and trying to prevent some of these things, and investing on the front end. And so for me, with my background being in medicine, I had to shift and think like, okay, this isn't working. These families are just waiting for their child to de-escalate and then taking them home with no new concrete tools or avenues. And so for me, I think that just started me asking good questions of like, what are we doing? And why is it perhaps not working? And I think that was what started was just that perspective shift of saying, if this isn't working, we can't just keep doing the same thing, expecting different results. We have to step back and ask ourselves why. And for me, a lot of that came down to I just don't think most kids with a history of significant trauma fit into specific diagnostic boxes that we had to work with as medical professionals. And so, we're going to, like you said, we're going to talk more about advocacy down the line. But I think until we have a diagnosis that better fits our kids, we have to do work, within the spaces that we have to just educate professionals and then work backwards versus trying to cram them into the boxes that modern medicine or therapy gives us.
Hmm. Well, and I think when people are faced with those boxes that they have to check, then we jump into those judgments of how could a family let a child get to this point, or how could a family do this to a child, and why isn't the parent or caregiver doing A, B, and C?
Yeah.
And that then I think really narrows our, well, it narrows our mind, but it narrows our options in terms of then providing support and resources, because we've already closed doors for those caregivers who, you know, I would say most. There are obviously cases where there is significant mental health challenges in the parent themselves, but most are trying the best they can with what they
Yeah.
have.
Well, and
And
you talk about judgment too. My favorite thing to do is one of my favorite things to do is tell on myself because I think it just helps everyone know they're in the same boat, right? And so I always share, if you would have asked me 20 years ago if every child can always live in a family forever and ever, I would have 100% said yes. Like no child should ever not live in family. And
mhm,
that was just very underinformed of me. And now I have come to see just a higher level of intensity of behaviors and challenges and dynamics that sometimes do require different environments. And I see it now rather as, the family just giving up on the child, which is maybe how I would have seen it 20 years ago, to, this child really needs a higher level of care than what this family can currently provide. And so now in my coaching with families, I try to explain it that way rather than making sure that as you're communicating this to your child, it's not like, we don't want you in the home or we can't deal with you. It's we want you to have the support that you need. And right now that looks like other professionals stepping in to help us. So to your
mhm,
point, like I think the judgment, and just as I learned and saw different situations, it really has helped me to shift and to like you said, come at a place where we have more options and we're being more collaborative and strengths based.
mhm. I mean, I love your point about it's really about reaching a point of acceptance and understanding that things will may have to be different than what you thought they were going to be.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that is applicable to everyone, not just the family, but also to us as professionals. And that you can't, yes, there are things that we can find commonalities in, that we can, find similarities in. Okay, this family's going through this. It could be similar to this family, but really every situation is different.
Mm-hmm.
And um, I think about the complexities of fostering and the complexities of adoption, and
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot that we aren't going to go into today about that. There's a lot of perspectives that then voices that need to be heard. But I think that everyone needs to start with an open level of understanding
Mm-hmm.
that there are
Totally.
different voices, there are different experiences. There's the child, there's the caregiver, there's the system, there's the people supporting them,
Yep.
um, before we jump into any kind of judgment
Yep.
whatsoever.
Yeah, and the more we can stay curious about all of those different
Mm.
perspectives versus judgmental, I think we obviously get to a better place.
Well, and I think that your comment staying curious, that is the complete kind of opposite of that medical
Hmm.
perspective, right?
Yep.
Which is a medical perspective is great, I think, when you're dealing with a broken leg and
Hmm.
so on, because it is very factual. It's broken here, it needs to be fixed
Hmm.
here, and this is how we do it. And it is so simple and almost checkboxy. But when we're dealing with the mind and the soul and the spirit,
Hmm.
really, it's not as easy
A
as
lot
that.
more
So,
gray.
right.
Yes.
Um, so let's talk a little bit about let's switch a little bit. I mean it links, but you I know that you have worked with families and you support families who are trying to support a child who has severely challenging problems,
Hmm.
or behaviors. And so that's something, of course, that we work with a lot at Chaddock too. Our children who are coming from trauma come to us with, a huge array of behaviors. Often for those outside of this world, they are scary and violent, and confusing. And
Yeah.
so I know that I want to hear a little bit about your course that you've designed too,
Mhm.
because we do see your courses on problematic sexualized behaviors, which is just one of an array of
Mhm.
challenges that we see and we work with when we have children who have come from trauma or disrupted attachment. So tell us a little bit about your experience and what led you to designing this course as well.
Yeah. So in the last 4 years, as I moved into this space more full time and started working with Chosen, I initially started doing parent coaching and some training, and just really loved that. Loved working with families one on one, and over time, just started identifying gaps both for families and professionals. So you and I know there's a lot of really good basic trauma education out there now, thankfully. I don't think that I could have said that 10 or 15 years ago, but you look at TBRI. We have another course called Trauma Competent Caregiver through an organization called Trauma Free World that we use. And I think those are really important. I also found that as I was working with families, many of them had already done some basic trauma education, and the behaviors that they were experiencing in their home, the gap between their knowledge and implementation of those things as it related to these specific, what we in this world call externalizing behaviors, the gap was really large. And so they felt very discouraged. They're like, we've done all the trauma training. We've done TBRI, we've done Empowered to Connect, we've done all these things. But we just don't know how to deal with X, Y, or Z thing. And so to your point, it was, lying and stealing or aggression, or my kid screams and curses all the time, or they're, and then this problematic sexualized behavior came up. So I just started seeing trends in the families that we were working with, where when I went to look for resources for the families I was coaching, there weren't anything that I felt good about. And
Hmm.
so at that point, I stepped into the role of director of training and content, and really in the last year or so, have just focused on where are the major gaps from a resources standpoint. And one of the ones that we identified early on was problematic sexual behavior. I think we're going to get into this a little more later today, but these types of behaviors trigger an internal response to us as parents and caregivers. So we
Hmm.
have to start there, whether it is, aggression, verbal or physical aggression that triggers fear in me. All of a sudden, then now I'm not in the right place in my brain to help this child, right? And PSB is the same way. There are so many fears, insecurities, a lack of feeling like I have the tools to deal with this, that very much very quickly puts caregivers and parents and even sometimes staff in a fear-based, shame-based frame of mind, which we all know, theoretically makes it really hard for us to show up the way we want to show up.
Hmm.
And so when we know that, trying to help give tools and provide hope and dispel some myths, I said, I think this is going to help people get back into the right part of their brain, their prefrontal cortex, to deal with these issues. We've got to help families. And so we developed a training called Displacing Shame, and I'm just super proud of it. I think it's going to be super helpful. And there's a 101 course that everyone has to take first. And it does just that. It looks at like what is normal versus what is concerning. I think even that there's confusion for many
Hmm.
people. And then what are some myths that are driving these fear related responses from people that are engaging with these children? And then just some basics of how do I respond? And then from there, we have 4 different tracks. And so we have tracks for residential staff, so non-clinical staff that are going to be a house parent or somebody that's going to be engaging with kids daily in a caregiver role. Then we have one for faith-based organizations like churches and camps. We have one for administrators and leaders, really looking at how these behaviors, externalizing behaviors, particularly PSB, impact capacity and bottom line outcomes with increased mental health costs, and why it's important to shift our approach. And then the last one is for caregivers. And so once you've taken the 101, you can choose where you fall in those 4 tracks and go to the deeper dive. And each one of those really looks at very practical tools and helps for shifting our approach from just, a safety mentality, which is important. Safety is obviously so important.
Hmm.
But we want a holistic approach that gives kids something to turn towards, not just away from, and really looks at how do we help them heal, which relates to attachment, relates to regulation, relates to connection, so many things just beyond just saying that behavior is not okay and that behavior is not safe. We've got to do
Hmm.
better there. So just super excited. And that's just one. We do a lot of other courses, but our goal at Chosen in the training And content arm is really to find those gaps and to lean in where we feel like other people haven't done so yet. We don't want to recreate the wheel. We really want to lean in where there's gaps that are really impacting families' ability to stay together.
hmm Well, I mean, it sounds fantastic. And when you and I talked previously, it was something that stood out to me. I think, and your words of leaning in, I think so many people do push back and pull away when it comes to behaviors that are extremely aggressive or extremely sexualized or, extremely uncomfortable for
Hmm.
people. Bodily fluids, for example,
Yep.
which we often deal with when we have children who have come from trauma, and as their means to keep people away from them.
Hmm.
And so I really appreciate you not shying away from the topics. um, as I'm thinking about it, my mind is going into, I mean, I am a parent, but if I were a parent in this situation, you know the process that I would have to go through, or the process a parent might have to go through to get to even a point of, oh, I need this course.
Hmm.
And then having the course and actually being able to receive the information. Do you have any have you come up with any barriers or, real points of hesitation for families and parents? And how do you manage that? How do you provide that extra support for those families?
I think in general with this topic, even maybe more so than some of the other externalizing behaviors we've mentioned, there's a lot of stigma. And
Hmm
so I have found that even families that are in the most highest level of crisis won't show up to a training because they just don't want anyone to know. They're so afraid for their child
hmm
being stigmatized. They're afraid that they're going to be labeled or judged as parents, that their child is struggling with this. And so that was one of the reasons why this was the first course we put on demand, because I was just finding so many barriers for people to show up live or live virtual, even with the cameras off, like they just didn't want anyone else to know, they weren't ready for that. And so
hmm
I think having this course be one of the first ones that we're releasing on the LMS, is for that reason. I think it just provides people that middle ground where if you're not ready to tell anyone yet, that's okay. Like start with getting some education. And I'm a big believer that having that community is going to be helpful for the individual long term, but we can take baby steps there. And so I think just like getting the information, educating yourself can be a really great and powerful step to moving the needle forward a little bit without feeling so exposed.
hmm Well, and what's great is that you're really modeling a parallel process for you're going to take baby steps with the caregivers,
Hmm.
just as I would assume, are going to be taking baby
Hmm.
steps with the child or young person that we're working with. That this isn't something, again, that you can just, oh, you can't behave like that, and
Hmm.
so just because I say so, there's so much depth to where these behaviors are coming from,
Hmm.
and we can't expect a child to change in an hour or overnight. And um yeah, so I mean, I think that that's a great option, a great starting point to allow people to gently dip into it and feeling safe at the same time. We to link to that, we had talked a little bit, you and I had talked a little bit about, if I'm a family member, parent, caregiver, and I'm in this situation, how are some ways that I might be able to balance, the safety of the child with the externalizing behaviors and the maybe the other children in my care or the other young people that they find themselves in situations with? Have you found anything that might work, or or even how do you just help support when people are going through this?
Yeah, I actually pulled up just, I had this written down because I wanted to share. The Institute of Child Psychology just posted recently on their social media that there's been a major shift as it relates to child abuse in the last 30 years. And they shared that in 1992, 40% of sexual abuse cases were committed by a child against another child. But in 2022, that stat has risen to 70%.
Oh, wow.
So there's real fear and real risk
Uh-huh.
here. And so I want to validate families in saying it's complicated, especially if you have a child,
Mhm.
other children in your home. Like the fears are real. And I think the best way that we can combat that is by being proactive. And so a couple of things. One, I would say all families, even families not struggling with problematic sexual behavior, we have to do better about being proactive, about talking about bodies, body boundaries, consent. I did not grow up in a home where it was freely talked about. And so, because of that, I came into this parenting journey feeling ill equipped, having my own
Mhm.
shame triggers, having my own fears. And so, I had to get curious about my own journey of like, okay, how is this talked about in my home? How does that impact me? Um, in my view of sexuality and sex and these behaviors. And so, I think that curiosity is always such a good place to start, both for our children and for ourselves, of getting kind of thinking through that. And so I think proactivity is really important, whether that's creating a safety plan in your home because you know you have a child that's struggling to keep everyone safe, whether that's starting really young with your kids to talk about and we have some tools we're going to link to in the show notes, but talking about who would you go to if somebody did something that made you feel uncomfortable. Something that's really new in this kind of generation that wasn't in mine is like you are in charge of your own body. So I'm not going to make
Mhm.
you hug or kiss your aunt or your grandma. So I think there's growing awareness of the importance of that, but I think we're often still limited just by our own histories and our own insecurities. So getting curious about our own
Mhm.
comfort levels and then just trying to do the work and take those small steps to get more comfortable so that we can have those conversations and we can create the spaces where our kids come to us as the experts. They come to us as the safe space when they've messed up, when they're afraid, when somebody's told them something that they need more information on. I think that proactivity is important even if you don't have a child in your home that's struggling. And so that's
Mhm.
part of the resources we've developed is like, how can we just help you to be more proactive? And then on the other side, I kind of alluded to it, but if you have a kid struggling in your home on any level, a good safety plan is so important because a good safety plan keeps the child who's struggling safe and everyone else in the home safe and just
Mhm.
sets kind of a framework for this is how we're going to do life together in a way. And often it really promotes attachment. Like I tell families, you can see this one of two ways. If your child needs a lot of support, maybe even line of sight supervision for a period of time, you can frame it like you have these behaviors that are so unsafe that you can't be left alone and you can't be trusted, which is often
Mhm.
where we go because we're uncomfortable, because maybe we were parented or our experience was kind of shame filled. But I said, what if we reframe that and we say, I love you so much that I want to be able to provide this level of support while you're working through these things so that I can keep you safe and I can make sure that
Mhm.
you have the support you need when you're struggling. And that's
Mhm.
a totally different way of seeing the exact same intervention and can really promote attachment because you're there to do that attachment cycle dance over and over and over in
Mhm.
this period of
Mhm.
time when the child actually probably does need a very high level of engagement like that.
I'm smiling because I'm thinking about my own toddler right now,
Hmm.
and she is all into climbing things and getting on things, and
Hmm.
we have to have pretty much that line of sight
Hmm.
all the time, and I'm like, where does that where and why does that change? Because that what you described is exactly what we do. We're doing it
Hmm.
because we need to keep you safe. We
Hmm.
love you. We don't want you to hurt yourself.
Hmm.
We're not doing it because you're bad and this is a bad behavior. This is you. And I think this is where it gets complicated for people is this is age appropriate behavior for
Sure.
her. And at some point in a child's life, there will be age appropriate sexual exploration. There will be
Hmm.
age appropriate other kind of exploration. And we will then hopefully, if we have a pretty healthy mindset, will apply the same knowledge. I need to increase my boundary, my limitations and expectations and my structure to keep you safe.
Hmm.
But at some point it shifts.
Hmm.
When we have a child who is showing these explicit behaviors, there's a shift.
Hmm.
And it's, I have to shut this down right away. And you have to stop because it's bad. And I have to put all these things in place because you're bad. And even if we don't say that, that's the feeling that gets portrayed instead of, I'm here to keep you safe because I love you. Um,
Yeah, and it's a lot of that is just it's just fear in ourselves, right? Like,
mhm,
And again, I just want to validate the parent experience or the caregiver experience. It's okay if that's where you're starting. It's really normal
Absolutely.
to feel triggered and to feel like shame is your only tool in your toolbox. I feel like a lot of families reach for that shaming of the child, not because they're intentionally trying to shame the child, but because they know it's going to work and it's going to work quickly, at least to
Hmm.
modify the behavior in the moment. And so I think just being aware, like, man, I think I have been using shame to try to change this behavior, and it's because I have really big fears around it, and we start there and we say, okay, that's where we're starting, and how do we take baby steps towards maybe building the tools in our toolbox that we can when we're engaging these behaviors. And I think to your point about like in the home, I think that when we talk about keeping all the kids in the home safe, I think one of the biggest things I am a proponent of with safety plans is that all rules apply to all people. And I think that's just one way we can diminish shame. And it may be a little more work on our part, but I think a subtle way that we really shame these kids is by making a very high, rigid set of rules for only the child that's struggling. And
Hmm.
even like you said, even if we don't say it, that just feels so punitive and so ostracizing. And so the more that we can just set up our home and our rhythms and the ways that we engage in a way that applies to everybody. And honestly, in a way that generally serves all kids, right? Like having good body boundaries and having good privacy in our home and making sure we're not exposing them to any explicit content. Like, honestly, they really do serve everyone. And so if we can set it up in that way, I've just seen it be so helpful to these kids that are struggling to help them not feel that shame and that isolation that comes when all the rules are just for the one kid that's struggling.
Hmm. I'm so glad that you said that because that's something that we really preach about with our treatment approach at Chaddock too, is that yes, the approaches are especially good if you are a child who's experienced trauma or attachment disruptions, but they're good for every child.
Hmm.
A lot of the time they're good for the adults too,
Hmm.
you know?
Yep.
And so I love that. All rules for all people, you know? Like I think that's a great way of approaching it. And not only that, but keeping it a little more simple too. You know,
Hmm.
we have a very simple set of rules at Chaddock that in our residential settings that they follow, and you know, there's a lot of things that can come up under that. Um, and so when I think about families who find themselves in these situations, it can all seem so daunting and overwhelming. And I want to backtrack a minute and uh, re kind of reconfirm what you said in terms of everybody starts somewhere. Nobody's perfect.
Hmm.
We all have moments where we say things that maybe we shouldn't have said
Hmm.
or wish we could take back, and that's always going to happen. And that's okay as long as we are trying to be a little bit more intentional about making it less frequent,
Yeah.
and reflecting on maybe what could I have done a little bit differently to, you know, change this and
Yeah.
change that outcome for that child. So I'm so glad that you said that. This is not a place for pointing fingers or laying
Hmm.
blame. It's a place of how do we grow from here. So speaking of kind of grow, well, let's stay with this for a minute because I think this would be helpful here. We talked about, because I think this links to what we've just said about, you know, how parents and caregivers may feel, you know, I'm stuck here. Yes, I engage in these shame behaviors all the time. You and I talked about the internal monologue of
Hmm.
the foster or adoptive parent, and how that can impact, you know, our ability to connect with a child or young person. Just tell me a little bit more about that. What do you mean by an internal monologue, and how does it show up for us?
So I share in a lot of my trainings that we talk to ourselves at a rate of 4,000 words per minute, which is
Oh
way
my
faster
goodness.
than anyone could ever talk. Even me from Michigan, it's faster than I can talk, which is saying a lot. And so I just think it's so important that we acknowledge that many words per minute talking to ourselves, what we are telling ourselves matters and significantly impacts how we behave, how we engage with the world. And so I always encourage parents and caregivers to start with just increasing your awareness of what you're talking to yourself about. And so that can be in journaling, that can be with a trusted friend or a therapist, wherever your comfort level is, but starting somewhere and
Mhm.
doing it in a way that also is not shaming of yourself, but trying to stay curious. And so if you have to literally throw the paper in the fire after you're done because you're so embarrassed of what you wrote down and that's where you're starting, that's okay. But just becoming aware of the narratives that we are saying, particularly about our children that are struggling, is so important to start there. Because if I'm regularly rehearsing in my brain things like, my child is disgusting, my child is a menace, my child is going to harm others, my child is putting my other kids at risk, I'm going to go to jail. Many of the thoughts that families come to me and share, it's going to impact our ability to be responsive and not just reactive when our kids have these behaviors. And so I can teach you all the tools to fill up your toolbox, but if in your heart and your mind you're rehearsing over and over things that are keeping you stuck in fear, keeping you stuck in speaking things over your child in your, even just in your own mind, that kind of puts them on a trajectory where there is no hope, it's going to be very
Mhm.
hard to reach for the other tools. And we're going to
Mhm.
fall back into some of the fear-based responses that we have. And so just starting by without shame, noticing what you're thinking about your child, particularly as it relates to these problematic behaviors. And then the second step, once we've done that, is to try to speak truth to those things that perhaps are based in fear or in absolute not truth. So,
Mhm.
so we talk a lot in the 101 course about, things that are actually fear-based myths. So one of the myths we talk about is that, every child that experiences PSB goes on to become an adult sex offender. Now, while many of us might say, well, I know that's not true, are we rehearsing that idea or that fear in our head? Because if we're rehearsing constantly, my child has these behaviors, what are they going to do when they're an adult? I call that future tripping, right? Where we take the current behavior and we just extrapolate it to the worst degree. It's
Mhm.
going to be very hard to stay out of my own fear brain. And so then I can start to challenge that thought when I think, oh, this child is doing this thing, they're going to be X, Y, or Z. I can think, actually, the facts say that most adult offenders didn't have these behaviors when they were children. And the facts say that most of these children, when they get appropriate intervention, over 95% of them do not offend as adults. So I can start to take actual factual evidence and reframe or inform the thoughts that I'm having in a way that helps me to, again, stay out of my own fear brain and react and respond instead of being so reactive in these moments.
Hmm. I love that. I mean, it's a form of CBT, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's when we're not in that reactive moment and we're calm, we're out of our back brain, then we can apply logic to the
Mm-hmm.
things that are going on for us in those moments. I mean, I can certainly relate to that from just a very simple parent experience of when your child won't go to sleep. See,
Mm-hmm.
I said it. She won't go to sleep, but it's
Yep.
it's not that she won't go to sleep. It's that she's struggling to go to sleep. That,
Mm-hmm.
it's hard for her, and it's isn't it hard for all of us sometimes
Mm-hmm.
to go to sleep, fall
Yep.
asleep? And so, you know, all of us have this narration that's going
Mm-hmm.
on. And I just love that you are really just normalizing it
Mm-hmm.
and saying that it's okay, and let's see what we can do to reduce some of that so that you're in a better position to connect with your child or young person.
For sure.
So, okay, let's talk a little bit about advocating for families, because I think this is really a really important piece.
Yeah.
Um, I in our questions I had put particularly with schools, because I
Mm-hmm.
think that this is, there's a gap, as you
Mm-hmm.
said earlier, but there's barriers, and there's so many pieces that come into play when we send a child to school, and there's other children, obviously. And so what are some ways maybe that you have helped to advocate, or would you recommend that maybe a therapist or another professional might help to advocate for a family?
Yeah, I love that we're circling back to this because this kind of came up earlier about boundaries and structure. So one of the basic principles that I think underpins all of this is giving children the level of support they need to be successful, not just based on their chronological age, right? And that
Hmm.
applies to so many things. And that can be challenging for the schools, that can be challenging for groups, that can be challenging for us as parents because when I'm having to give a toddler level of structure to a 14-year-old that's looking down at me, there's some kind of internal struggle that happens for us as parents, myself included. And it takes a lot of reframing to tell myself, I'm providing the level of structure that my child needs in the season to be safe in this area. And that is really critical when we're talking about these externalizing behaviors. So when it comes to that, I would say starting there of sharing with the child's school or other professionals that are helping them, my child in this area needs a higher level of structure than their peers because of their
Mhm.
history. I try really hard to stay general. I don't think very few people, if any, need to know all the nitty-gritty details of your child's story. And so that's really
Mhm.
important to let them be in charge of who and when they tell their story too. But just explaining, hey, in the area of body, privacy, and sexuality, my child needs a little higher level of structure. And I would love to talk to you guys about what this looks like in our home and how some of these might be transmitted in the school environment. And I think just starting with that invitational approach rather than, a place of like that this kid's going to be ostracized or my kid's not safe to be
Mhm.
around other children. So starting that way, but also just not putting it on the school either of like, you need to make sure that this happens, but being invitational. Hey, I'd love to share what works for us. I'd love to share some kind of high risk situations that I would love to address at the school and brainstorm together to help keep my child and other children around them as safe as we can. And then I would just say the third thing is what you and I kind of alluded to when we chatted beforehand, which is not to be melodramatic, but sometimes we do have to look for alternative options. There are some
Mhm.
school systems or areas or lower resourced communities where going to a X, Y, or Z school, like they can't meet your child at a level where they can be successful. And I think just being realistic about that as parents and caregivers and saying, we've tried or we've asked, and we're just not going to be able to get the level of support. And how can we try to then look elsewhere, look for alternative ways, even if it's just for a season, rather than continuing to try to force the issue and put the child in situations where they may be unsafe, because we
Mhm.
just don't want for that for any child or the child themselves, right, that's already struggling with shame to act in a way that then is going to heap more shame on them internally. So I just think
Mhm.
sometimes we do have to get creative in certain scenarios.
I mean, to me, it sounds like, and this is putting it very simply, which is none of these situations are simple, but that there really just needs to be understanding on all parts,
Mhm.
understanding from the school that the family has tried things, is doing what they can to put safety measures in place that as necessary, that they're showing up, that they want to be a part of their child's schooling, and then understanding on the other side of the family's part that if you do have a school that is trying and they're trying to work with you and putting things in place, but that this, as you said, just might not be a place where they can provide the level of support that your child needs, to be able to understand that and not take it personally, which is so hard
It
because
is.
sometimes there are places that are just like, yeah, I'm just gonna wash my hands
Mhm.
of you. So it's not simple by any means, but if we can all try to approach situations with open minds and understanding, then sometimes those conversations get just a little bit easier to
Mhm.
have.
Yeah. And to your point with involving a therapist or another professional, I think the more we can take the heavy lift off the school and say, here are some ideas. I mean,
Hmm.
they're just teachers and school systems are so overloaded with all of the different requirements and all of the different needs of individual students. And so I'm a big fan of creating a safety plan, like a proposal for the school with the child's therapist and saying, these are the environments we'd like them to have, maybe one-on-one supervision. Can you accommodate? Is even better, right? If we can take the
Hmm.
extra step of not making them draft the plan, but just kind of lean in and make some corrections or edits, I think that also is really helpful.
I love that. I mean, to me that shows, I mean, it shows effort on the family's part and it shows them being understanding. Yeah, like you said, our schools and our school systems and our staff are particularly overloaded. And so I think that that's a great way of approaching the situation, and then asking, is this something that you can accommodate? Uh, yeah, it just opens that door for conversation. So I love that idea. Bethany, was there anything else that we haven't touched on that you wanted to talk about? I don't know. I'm going to throw this out there. You mentioned to me that you might be thinking about writing a book at some point.
Yes. Yes. I think just the attachment, I alluded to the fact that I have adult children that joined our family after 18, and I would love to just share, what I've learned from making mistakes and doing a couple things right. And in that attachment dance, I think it's super unique where you're trying to build attachment with a full-grown adult, right? At a time
Mm,
when they're developmentally supposed to be differentiating and spreading their wings. It can be challenging, but I've just found so much beauty in the relationships I have with those adult kiddos. And I wish more people were willing to raise their hand and say, like, even after 18, we all want a place to go on the holidays, right? We all still have questions. I call my parents all the time still, and I'm in my 40s. So I just would love to write something that would help people feel empowered and have the tools they need to say, I'd like to walk alongside a young adult. And it's been a privilege. I'm getting ready to go in a couple weeks to meet up with one of my adult sons who's about to ask his girlfriend to marry him and wants me to meet her family. And I mean, the joy of doing that while I still have a 7-year-old in my house, it's so fun. And I have grandbabies that are the same age as my kids, my youngest. And
mm.
so it's just a really unique, fun circus we have over here that I'd love to share someday with the world.
Well, I think that that sounds wonderful, and I hope that you let me know when you've written it and it's coming out because I would love to read it. Thank you so much for being on the podcast today. I am very excited for our listeners to hear your story. I know that we have a lot of people that are either supporting foster and adoptive parents, or who are foster and adoptive parents themselves. And I think that this will be hugely valuable for them. So thank you so much, Bethany.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.